Well, before we get into the kind of bigger stuff like Fatima Garbandal and Father Malachi Martin, I'm sure people would like to get your opinion on how you see the Catholic Church at the moment and what's happening to it, because we just had a quick chat before we went live, and a lot of people over here in Ireland have kind of walked away from the church because of things that have gone on. And it seems to be in what looks to be in a bit of a state of disarray with things that are going on at the moment. And I know, in your bio there, one of the things is that you didn't, you disagreed with the Second Vatican Council. So, where do you see the Catholic Church at the moment? Do you think we're going to have a church in 10 years' time, or what's happening?
The Catholic Church is in dead trouble. It's in its biggest crisis of all its history. And it has been, this crisis exploded. It didn't begin, but it exploded with Vatican II. The crisis goes back at least to the French Revolution, at least to the Protestant Revolution, and to the decline of the Middle Ages. So this crisis has been 700 years in the making. You can sum it up like this. The Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was a tremendous triumph, but exactly that triumph of St. Thomas Aquinas, the great doctrine, the great saints, the great discipline of the Middle Ages, although the men were still sinners and the churchmen were still sinners, but nevertheless the faith was at its height, was at high tide. But that faith, that strong faith of the Middle Ages then began to ebb. It began to ebb at the very height of the Middle Ages. When something is at the very height, it then begins to go down. And from the height of the Middle Ages, the Church began to decline, for instance, with Philippe le Bel in France. So, what you've got is the world, the mankind thinking more and more, we men can do it on our own, we don't need God. God can take back the back seat. Man pushing his way in front of God, more and more and more, until God is now hardly taken seriously by anybody. It's a disaster. It's an utter disaster, and it's going to bring down a chastisement heavier, said Our Lady in Japan in 1973 at Akita, a chastisement heavier than the deluge in the time of Noah. Then it was a flood of water, but in Scripture you can read that God said he wouldn't use water again, but he didn't say he wouldn't use fire. And when Our Lady spoke at Akita in Japan in 1973, she said it's going to be a rain of fire, R-A-I-N, a rainfall of fire. And that, I think, is what we're facing. Men are so far from God, and they're so stubborn in sin, and they're so blind and proud that, in the words of Solzhenitsyn, it's going to take a crowbar to smash the concrete casing with which human beings have shut themselves away from God. But God is going to step in. He's going to step in big time.
Okay.
And when he steps in, then there's going to be a great revival of the church, the greatest revival in all the history of the church. And then the corruption of that revival looks like being the arrival of the Antichrist in the end of the world.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because a couple of times on the show, over the years we've been doing the show, when you look at the way society is going, and Steve will quote me on this, but I have said it looks like the world has gone into like Sodom and Gomorrah, and something needs to be done.
Pius XII, Pope Pius XII, who died in 1958, said, before he died obviously, the world is in a worse state than it was at the time of Noah or in Sodom and Gomorrah.
Okay, so
and therefore you've got a Pope saying the same thing as yourself.